Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheran history. We hear new stories, examine old ones, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. So whether you're a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for real stories of trials, tragedies, or triumphs, you'll find what you're looking for right here. Today's guest is Professor Joel Otto. He's a 1995 graduate of Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. Having served 1 year in Midland, Michigan, he served several years at First German Lutheran Church in Manitowoc, where I also have some family roots, 5 years at Reformation in San Diego, and about 5 years at Trinity in Minocqua, Wisconsin. In 2011, he accepted a call to serve as professor of church history and education at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. Since 2016, he's also served as the Dean of Students. He was on the committee that produced the 2017 WELS Catechism, something I use in the classroom 3 times a week. And he also served on on the WELS Hymnal Committee for the new WELS Hymnal. He's been a writer for the Meditations and Forward in Christ through Northwestern Publishing House. In 2019, he earned his Master of Theology and Church History from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. A chapter of his thesis, which we're examining today, won the 2019 Abdel Ross Wentz Award, an award I had also won previously. And his entire thesis was given an award of commendation from Concordia Historical Institute just this past month here. So an edited version was published serially in Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly, and his entire thesis is available on the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary online essay file, and I think we'll include a link in the episode description. So, Professor Otto, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Pastor Phelps.
So, your title has the years in it. So, I think it's called Growing Under the Cross, Wisconsin Missions between 1929 through 1983. I maybe butchered the rest of the title, but I noted that you had those years in there. And often researchers find that for the sake of space and to have a scope on the research, they maybe have to put some years in there as parameters. So why did you select those years?
Well, 1929 was kind of a threshold in the Wisconsin Synod as far as a number of things are concerned. The transition from German to English was well underway, and you could probably say by that time English was becoming more predominant. So it wasn't just so much serving German immigrants anymore. 1929 marked the dedication of the new seminary in August of 1929 at what's now Mequon, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee, which was a major undertaking. Only the year previously, they had also established the last prep school, ministerial education school, boarding school at Mobridge, South Dakota, Northwestern Lutheran Academy. So all the school campuses were set up. And then, of course, the Great Depression hits, and there's this huge debt that the Synod is going to be facing. So that seemed like a time that seemed like a good starting spot. We were in Wisconsin Synod was in about 14 states and had no world mission work, overseas world mission work. 1983 marked the ending in my mind, because now the Wisconsin Synod was truly a nationwide and worldwide church body. By 1983, the last 2 districts of the Synod were established, and the Wisconsin Synod had at least some kind of presence in all 50 states. So you go from 14 states to 50. And there were world missionaries on the ground in 10 foreign countries. So just to see in that time frame the shift that you go from a church body that was serving primarily Midwestern German immigrants, with a few exceptions, to a true nationwide and in many cases worldwide church body. And just the fact that it was done, the reason why I chose the title "The Church Grows Under the Cross," it's kind of remarkable that all that happened with everything else that the Synod was facing. I mentioned the debt during the Great Depression. We might get into a few other things. I know in one of your questions about different obstacles that were faced, different crosses. When you add it all up, it just struck me and kind of captured my imagination that here all this was going on in the Synod, yet we still had a rather vigorous mission program that we were enabled to carry out by God's grace and strength.
Yeah, that's definitely a strong and consistent theme throughout your whole thesis. Is on one hand, there are many challenges, many obstacles, and on the other hand, there are a lot of blessings, a lot of growth from a kind of a human point of view. Just looking at the numbers or the geography, there's an undeniable growth going on. So you got us into a little bit of why you picked 1929 as the starting point, and what that looked like. Is there anything else you want to add to just kind of the, I don't know, state of the union of the Wisconsin Synod in the year 1921? What did it look like? What characteristics did it have?
Well, like I said, it had primarily been focused on serving German immigrants. It tended to be more rural. It's small town. It's kind of where the center was. You had a few urban areas like Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul. There was, I think, one church in Seattle, one or just a couple of congregations in the Phoenix area. That was kind of an exception. Of the fact that even in 1929, Wisconsin Synod had congregations in Arizona was because of the Apache mission work that had been started already in the 1890s, and that led naturally to some missions in Arizona, and so there were a couple in the Phoenix area. But primarily, it's, you can Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, a little bit in Ohio and Illinois. There had been some, because of German immigrants moving to the Dakotas, you had North and South Dakota, there was a presence. And then because of some quirks, I guess you could say, in history, which would be kind of an interesting study too sometime, how we got into the Pacific Northwest as early as the early 1900s. There was a presence and the first district, and there was a district formed out in the Pacific Northwest. So, but primarily, again, it's kind of centered in the Midwest, centered in rural and small towns. Efforts were made to do mission work, but it was kind of limited to those areas. There was also some in Nebraska, of course, too. The Synod also was dealing with a controversy that had started in the mid 1920s in our Wisconsin Synod history. It's referred to as the Protestant controversy. This had kind of really rocked the Synod. It cost the Synod a couple of seminary professors, including the seminary president, J.P. Kaler. It's hard to describe it as a doctrinal controversy, more controversy over spirit almost and approach to things. But it had cost the Synod a number of congregations and pastors and some key leaders. And so by 1929, it was kind of dying down. For the most part, the worst of it had kind of passed, but it was still kind of hanging there. And it would not be, and it would even result in I think, contributed to a change in presidency in the Synod in 1933.
All right. Well, thank you for giving us that background and the context. So in the midst of all of that, maybe some negative things going on, or at least not positive. What were the factors that prompted this desire and the goal of now expanding the Synod's reach already in the 30s?
I think in general, you had voices within the Synod and maybe just a general spirit within the Synod that always said we should be expanding, we should be doing mission work. That's what a church does. There was some conflict within that. I think even J.P. Kaler would sometimes be a little bit critical, perhaps, of if you're latching onto the Great Commission too much, is there a little pietist flavor there at times that it's okay for a church body to be focused on doctrine? I think you'd have a guy like August Pieper who'd say it was both and, not just, there never should be an either or. But I think in general, you see the need for the gospel to be spread, and there were opportunities that were growing. And the frustrating part, especially during the 30s, you did have voices that even wanted to start overseas mission work, but it was always, we don't have the money and we have this huge debt. The debt was it ended up getting to about $750,000, which in 1929 money would have been, I forget what the total was exactly, but it would have amounted to I think it was like $3 per baptized member. which again, during the Great Depression it was just debilitating. The Synod president constantly had to make decisions on, are we going to pay this month the missionaries or are we going to pay the professors? And so it was just very difficult to get any traction. And it was the concerted effort over the course of about 10 years from 1935 to 1945, paying down that debt, that really set things up for more expansion occurring after the Second World War ended.
Yeah, and your paper kind of describes almost like the swing of just the mood seemed to be very pessimistic, maybe for obvious reasons during the Great Depression, right? Everyone's a little depressed by it. But by 1945, with the debt paid off, and not only that, the World War II is coming to an end. Seems like everyone was rather optimistic and just looking how to do more with what they had.
Yeah, and I think one of the, you talk about pessimism, you can just imagine during the 1930s and into the early 40s, most of the seminary graduates were not assigned immediately. And you can just imagine the kind of the blanket of enthusiasm that would, the blanket that would just cloud any enthusiasm for doing anything when you've got all these workers sitting around, but just there's no money for them, no place to assign them. My grandpa Otto graduated in 1934 and did not get assigned immediately, but there were relatives. He had relatives out on the Apache reservation, so they brought him out there. We'll put you to work. We'll find something for you to do. And then something opened up, and he got assigned, and then he got a call out there and stayed there for a few years. And met my grandma out there, so who had come out to be a deaconess nurse at the orphanage that was out there, and he picked her up at the train station, and the rest is history, as they say.
There you go.
But that just, you had a lot of workers standing idle, and that was frustrating. President Brenner even mentioned that in some of his presidential reports to Synod conventions.
Yeah, so maybe the opposite problem of many churches today, including the Wisconsin Synod, of having too many workers to know what to do with, rather than not having the right opportunities to do anything with them. Whereas today we have plenty of opportunities and not enough workers. So it's maybe good for us to look through history and see it never was ever perfectly easy, right? Just the challenges maybe change over time. So you mentioned some of the obstacles already, but your paper kind of uses the idea of there's a cross, there's a challenge, and then it is overcome, or at least dealt with in some way. So let's just, go through, if we can. What are some of those other challenges that the Wisconsin Synod faced as it expanded both its world and home missions?
Well, one of the challenges I'd say is, especially as you were coming out of World War II, I mean, we mentioned during the Depression, probably the biggest one was the financial, just the Synod debt problem. But after World War II, I think it was one of the issues was a matter of Synod priorities. Every Synod campus, with the exception of the seminary in Mequon, needed massive building projects. And throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you end up seeing almost like the Watertown campus, where the pastor training college was, Northwestern College and prep school, was almost completely rebuilt. The New Ulm Teacher College had numerous building projects. The prep school in Saginaw, Michigan Lutheran Seminary was brand new buildings. Even in Mobridge, they built a brand new building. And so just the expenditures that went into the capital expenditures, and so you had this kind of tug of war over finances. You also have the matter of during the 1950s, and then again in the 1970s, there was an influx of a founding of numerous area Lutheran high schools. A group of them were founded in the 50s, and another group in the 70s, and that took away, that took energy and money, and even called workers for manpower issues. Then I'd say at the local level, congregations and schools were just going through unbelievable building projects in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so there's just a lot of stuff going on. And then if that weren't enough, then starting in 1938, 39, going through 1961, there's a controversy with the Missouri Synod that really consumes a lot of time and effort and energy on the part of the Wisconsin Synod. And I know I go into that a little bit more in the paper. Up until 1961, the Wisconsin Synod often relied on the Missouri Synod to take care of a lot of things. The Missouri Synod was 5 times bigger than the Wisconsin Synod. So if people, and they were all over the nation. So if members of the Wisconsin Synod moved to, say, Florida or Georgia or wherever, Texas, you just transfer the membership to those Missouri Synod congregations. Well, as the doctrinal controversy over church fellowship was ensuing, there was less and less desire to do that. And once the break happened in 1961, now you couldn't anymore. And that, I would say, that served as a catalyst to getting missions started in throughout the nation, rather than just continuing in our enclave of maybe 14 to 16 states. And then there's you have the surplus of workers in the 30s and 40s, and then by late 40s you got a shortage of workers. You don't have enough pastors, and that kind of continues really all the way until the mid to late 60s. It's not until you get to the late 60s, especially early 70s, where there is a number of larger, or there's a trend in larger classes graduating from the seminary, that you are able to have the manpower necessary to really get to start all these home missions that you'll see starting, and get into more world missions. In many ways, there's almost the perfect storm occurs in the late 60s and into the early 70s, where you actually have the finances and you have the manpower kind of converged in that time. Otherwise, almost every other time throughout the Synod's history, you either have a shortage of money or a shortage of manpower.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the Pacific Northwest earlier. I had the opportunity to do a district presentation just for the 100th anniversary of our district, and just even looking at Alaska, all of our congregations pretty much popped up maybe very late 60s or just through the 70s and maybe early 80s. It was just about a dozen years, and there they all were. We're pretty much the same place where we've been. And part of that is local demographics too of population, but growth and such. But yeah, definitely looking at our synod, we had that boom just at a local level.
I think Faith Anchorage was the first one, right?
Yes, and that was sometime in the 60s, and then the rest all came rather quickly after. And it was very interesting to how they dealt with the manpower shortages. Then they used a little unorthodox way, the way the seminary does it today, but they sent the vicar out to the mission site, and the supervising pastor would maybe fly in on his own for in-person visit once a week or something like that. But really the vicar was kind of the man on the ground at those locations while they got started. So yeah, very, very interesting, creative ways to get that stuff done. All right. Well, you mentioned a lot of the obstacles then, some of them internal, some of them were just external factors. A lot of that was with home missions. What about the foreign missions? We started off with Japan and Africa. Was that an easy thing to get started, or were there some challenges there as well?
Yeah, the challenge there was probably one of, again, it kind of came down to synodical priorities. 1945, you have the synod, the debt's paid, there's actually a surplus, and that convention, there was a little bit of controversy. Edgar Heinecke was I think at the time he was the Apache chairman, the chairman for the administrative committee for the Apache mission, and in his synod convention report, he said, we need to now go and start overseas mission work. And there was a little bit of controversy. The Synod President Brenner kind of called him out of order, discussions on the floor, and eventually it was approved to send an explorer, or to set up a committee to oversee some exploration of where we might want to do foreign mission work. Well, that committee kind of varying opinions among the members of the committee about do we wait for somebody to invite us? Do we go actively seek a place? And it wasn't until 1949 that they finally got approval that Edgar Haneke and Arthur Wacker, another pastor in Michigan, Haneke was in Plymouth, Michigan. The two of them went on an exploratory trip, which is just a fascinating story that's told in the WELS 49ers, published by the WELS Historical Institute. It was a whole issue of their journal. And just the whole story of them going over there over on a ship with a big camper, kind of converted camper, and making this big trip and finding eventually the spot that would lead to our mission work that's still being carried out now by the Wisconsin Synod in Zambia, and then expanded to Malawi. But even there, even after they got done, there's still, I think there was still reluctance on the part of the synodical leadership. We don't want to go into something without having sufficient funding. Especially President Brenner had lived through the 30s when he had to make those difficult decisions. Who do we pay? And just not wanting to enter something without a firm footing, financial footing. And then there were still, I think, some concerns about manpower. Do we have enough manpower to fund to manage a growth like this? And so, but by 1951, you'll see somebody who takes a call to start things in Japan, and even the Japan call was partly serve the American military personnel over there, and the other part was to start explore possibility of starting mission work in Japan. And then in 1953, a couple of missionaries were accepted calls to go to Central Africa, but it wasn't easy. There were, again, even Japan, the first effort had ended up falling apart because of that doctrinal controversy with the Missouri Synod that was embroiling the Synod. The missionary in Japan felt that the Wisconsin Synod wasn't breaking with the Missouri Synod soon enough. He felt it should have happened sooner, and he ended up basically taking everything was in his name, and that we had to kind of start over in 1957 in Japan.
Yeah, pretty tough going when your only guy there kind of walks away, I suppose. So that's pretty fascinating, though. You mentioned the whole Africa story. I guess we can get it into more of now how were they able to flourish and take root more. But the men on that exploratory committee, did they just spin the globe and put their finger down, or did they have any leads to why they started where they did? Do you recall that at all?
Well, I think it was decided that through the committee's, initial research during those 4 years, they kind of landed on Japan and Africa. Japan because of, again, I think partly because of the military personnel in the Korean War was just getting started, and there were just a lot of military there too. So kind of combining the two, military and mission potential. And then Africa, I think they had discussions with various other groups. I mean, there were a few other places in Africa that they kind of had feelers out for, but it was eventually decided that they'd send this 2-man team and they'd start in South Africa, and just they had a few connections and they'd check out those areas, and eventually each area along the way they'd get kind of, why don't you check out this place? Why don't you check out this place? And eventually they were looking for a place where there really wasn't another church established, that you weren't going to have some kind of rivalry or competition. Where can we go where nobody has been working at this time? So they eventually found that. Interesting. The initial place they found was called the Hook of the Kafui. It was a river in Zambia. But by the time we were able to get men over there, that region had already been snatched up, I think, by the Presbyterians or something. But there was another neighboring region in that what was then called Northern Rhodesia that the Synod ended up doing its work, and it kind of began in Lusaka and eventually spread to other villages and towns and bush areas throughout Zambia.
All right. Very interesting. And I'm sure that could be a whole nother topic in and of itself. Like you said, there's already been research on just those missions, but yeah, very, very interesting to see how they got started. And now I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but I'm just kind of looking at the numbers. Wisconsin Synod was founded 1850. or at least officially the Constitution was ratified then. And it's only in the 1950s that world missions take root outside of the United States. And that's 100 years of not doing world missions. And I guess if you don't know the answer off the top of your head, that's fine. I'm just kind of curious. Do you think that's because they had that kind of theological question? If no one calls us, we shouldn't go? Or was it more of the attitude of, well, we have the Synodical Conference and the Missouri Synod, the bigger people are probably handling world missions, we'll just handle what we can handle locally? Or was it kind of a both and attitude?
I think it was a both and. Well, I'm not so sure it was as much theological, because already back in when the Wisconsin Synod joined the Synodical Conference in 1872, its purpose was, let's work together and do mission work. Now, they decided initially to do mission work among the African Americans in the South in the late 1870s. When the Wisconsin Synod is on better footing, because part of it was, I think, we're just trying to get a handle on serving the people that we have around us, and the German immigrants that are coming over, being able to handle financially and manpower and resources to go somewhere else is a little more difficult. By 1892, when they come together with the Michigan and Minnesota synods to form a federation, one of the first things they do is, okay, let's do mission work. And they decide we'll go to the Apaches, and they found the Apache reservation in Arizona. So I don't think it's for lack of mission spirit. I think some of it's, a lot of it was resources. They were doing work, through the Synodical Conference, when the work began in Nigeria in the 1930s. In the 1930s, the Wisconsin Synod supplied a lot of manpower for that. In fact, the chief superintendent of that Nigerian mission was a Wisconsin Synod man, William Schweppe. The Wisconsin Synod was also doing work throughout the 30s among Lutherans who were in Poland. And so there was a couple of pastors that were working over there. So there was that. It was just, there were voices within the Synod that felt really strongly that we've got to go overseas. We got to do foreign overseas mission work. And there were others who said, well, maybe let's make sure we've got all our ducks in a row first, and maybe we should wait for someone to say, come over and help us. That's kind of how the work had gotten started in Nigeria in the 30s. It was kind of a group in Nigeria that said, come over and help us. So I think there was a bit of that, we want the Macedonian call kind of thing. But it ends up being through the exploratory work, at least in Africa, of those two men, Wacker and Heineke, that eventually led to the start of work in Zambia and then spreading to Malawi.
Yeah, it's probably a little unfair then to say, well, totally unfair to say that the Wisconsin Synod didn't do any mission work for 100 years. That's just not an accurate picture. I think sometimes maybe people get that impression when they hear, oh, our first world mission was in the 50s in Africa. It maybe seems that way, but yeah, that's a lot of good context that you've added to that.
And I'll say that was part of the reason for I think a little bit of the underlying reason for my paper thesis was to kind of say, yeah, no, we were doing mission work quite a while before that. And it wasn't like we were even just all of a sudden, it's after the break with Missouri that all of a sudden we're going out into all the states. We're endeavoring, even through some hardships in the 30s and 40s, to do mission work. We get into some new states in the 1950s. And of course, the catalyst is going to be the break with Missouri to go into all the states in a much more rapid way. And I think there were other contributing factors too, like the mobility of society in America that really accelerated in the 50s and 60s, led to that happening as well.
Yeah. Good point. So I think maybe we can talk about then what you had just been mentioning now that we've discussed foreign missions. The Wisconsin Synod, as you pointed out, had always had its hands full starting or organizing new congregations and sending pastors there. You just read the history of the Synod. That's pretty much all they're doing, is sending pastors to new communities where new towns are being built. And I think it's important for people to realize who live in 21st century America. You drive down the interstate and you've got all these communities. Well, they've always been there, always will be. Well, that just wasn't the case in the 1800s at all. You had nothing there as far as a city or a settlement was concerned, and then suddenly there is one. And who's going to organize a church there? That took a lot of work for decades, just at settling. I guess that's the frontier thesis, I suppose, of American history in general. But that kept the Wisconsin Synod occupied domestically, and there was more than enough to do with the immigrant population coming in, millions and millions of immigrants coming into the Midwest. Plenty to do for the Wisconsin Synod. But now, as you mentioned, that's why you kind of make 1929 that turning point, is the German immigration kind of dries up significantly. We're no longer a German-speaking synod primarily. It's certainly happening for many more decades, but we're now a little more mainstream speaking English. So can you talk us through how is this shift initiated in the 1930s and 40s to move out of the so-called heartland, out of the Midwest, to other areas? And then I guess we can talk about Florida, California, and then eventually the every state by 78. But let's start in the 30s and 40s domestically.
Well, again, the challenge was just the biggest challenge is having the finances. But there was a desire to expand work in Arizona, and so that happened. You go from by the time you get to the early 40s, Arizona is able to have enough congregations to form its own pastors' conference, and I think even mission conference. Coming out of Nebraska, and Arizona for that matter, Colorado was viewed as a good spot, and so we first get into Colorado in the 1930s. One of the more interesting finds that I came across was this 10-page report on two pastors who did an exploratory trip into Colorado and just all the different places they found, and that eventually led to a number of congregations founded. And again, by the early 40s, you have the California Mission District being established to manage all the new missions in Colorado. Plus, you had ongoing mission work in the the Dakotas, and out in the Pacific Northwest to some extent. So it's kind of building on what you had. You also had, even in the heartland, you still were looking for places to start missions. So you had some new ones started even in the Milwaukee area. I found one of the more fascinating ones, because I was pastor in Manitowoc, just knowing the history there, that First German in Manitowoc was lauded by the mission board as a kind of a neat example of carrying out mission work just by a local congregation. They got started. They were the city church downtown Manitowoc, and then they helped pretty much funded and founded Bethany Lutheran, which was on the west side, in an area where a lot of homes were going up because of workers who were building the submarines that were being constructed in Manitowoc. And then they were also part of the group that helped start another church on the north side of Manitowoc in the 40s. So you had numerous efforts going on just in a town like Manitowoc, but there were those mission efforts that were taking place. So they were just, again, trying to use the resources they had and trying to find places where they could start new congregations.
All right. So what can you tell us about getting into the so-called sunshine states? You already mentioned California a little bit. Florida, I think many so-called heartland congregations have a lot of members of their congregations who are also in Florida or Arizona these days. It seems to be that there are quite a few opportunities down there. Well, how do we get into the Florida area?
You want me to start with California? I can just talk California real quickly. Sure. California, the interesting thing there was that there had been apparently sort of a gentleman's agreement between a couple of a Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod guy back in the first decade of the 1900s, kind of saying, Wisconsin Synod, you take care of Arizona, and Missouri will take care of California. And that held true to about 1930, when Missouri Synod finally started some congregations in Arizona. Took until 1950 for the Wisconsin Synod to go into California. And the Missouri Synod was fine with us doing that, because they said, there's plenty of work to do here. So come on. And Missouri Synod pastors were even very helpful to the first Wisconsin Synod missionaries. So they didn't see it as competition. The Florida situation is a little more interesting, just the whole story behind it. And this is where, synod policies and things like that come into play. The home mission the synod had a policy that basically said you can't leapfrog states when you're starting new churches. The reason you could go to California was because we already had work in Arizona. And the reason why Arizona was leapfrog was because of the Apache reservation. So that was kind of the exception. But there was a desire, there was kind of a sort of Macedonian call type of thing in Florida with people who were wintering down there, Wisconsin Synod members who were wintering down there, and particularly a guy named Louis Ott, who was a member at the church in Cullin, Michigan, near Bay City and Saginaw, and was on the district mission board in the Michigan district. And so the Michigan district Michigan district mission board sort of took it on themselves, found a little loophole, I guess, in the policy that allowed for exploratory work to be done. And so they went in February of, I think it was 55 or 54 or 55. They went on an exploratory trip down to Florida. They were gone for a little over a week. Louis Ott drove them around. They pretty much went throughout the whole state trying to, what's the situation? Where might we be able to start missions? That sort of thing. And they caught a little flack for it. Seems that there was some criticism that they were taking a winter vacation. And they had to kind of defended themselves a little bit in one of their reports that, no, you don't travel this far and do all this if you're on vacation. And by the way, Paul accepted money and did exploratory work, so cut us some slack, huh? And then they ended up calling a pastor down there from the church in Cullin. The pastor there took the call down to Florida, and there was still some debate amongst from the synod mission board to the district mission board. Was this orderly? Was this maybe taking steps that shouldn't have been taken quite yet? The congregations of the Michigan district raised funds to help build the first church building. So it just kind of a fascinating story. Eventually, things all seemed to get settled down. I think it took a special meeting somewhere along the line. All you see in the minutes are the decisions that were made. You don't see the discussion that would happen, which I'm sure was, judging from some of the letters that went back and forth that I found in the archives, was probably a little bit heated. But they, in Christian brotherly discussions, eventually hammered things out, and so then you had a congregation, and by the end of the 50s, I think you had 3 pastors and 4 or 5 congregations in Florida, and the work was taking off pretty quickly.
All right, so I think that leaves us maybe one last major topic as far as just the content of your research is concerned, and that is got a catchy phrase with it. It's every state by 78. I've heard that somewhere. You probably were the one who taught me that phrase in church history sometime. It just came up, but now you wrote your thesis including it. So what was this program? I think it's pretty easy to understand that it seems like the goal of the Wisconsin Synod was to be in every U.S. state by 1978. Is that a fair guess?
Yes. I think it was Ray, if I remember right. Ray, the first time it shows up was in a report. I think it was it was a mission report or a mission board minutes or something like that by Ray Wickman, who was the 1963, I think it was. He was called to be the first full-time administrator or executive director of the whole mission program. And again, it was really a catalyst from the break with Missouri, because no longer could Wisconsin Synod pastors in good conscience encourage their members to transfer to the local Missouri Synod congregation if they moved out of where there wasn't a Wisconsin Synod church. So you're going to end up having Wisconsin Synod members in a lot of locations asking, that the request just came flooding in. Can you provide us with a pastor? Can we start a mission in this place and this place? And so you see it happening. The Michigan District Mission Board, and this is where organizational things take a while. For a while, pretty much every congregation and mission east of the Mississippi, more or less, was a part of the Michigan District, all the way down to Florida and all the way up the Atlantic Seaboard. All those churches were under the auspices of the Michigan District. Eventually, you'll have mission districts formed, and then eventually in 1973, you'll have the South Atlantic District, and then North Atlantic District gets founded in 1983. and then there'll be one in South Central, which basically is Texas and Oklahoma. But you just have this drive to get churches founded, and most of the time it's going to be in the kind of ideas. Let's start a congregation in a city and then try to circle the city with churches and missions in the suburbs. So you'll see that, like in Houston, there'll be a congregation in Houston proper, and then pretty soon there are other missions started, in the suburbs. Dallas, the same thing. Las Vegas, just a number of urban areas that you see that. Not as much out east. That was a little bit of a harder go. In the Northeast, New England states, Mid-Atlantic, those were a little bit more difficult to get things started. But for the most part, again, you see that just the efforts were made to get a congregation. And I think the last state was Maine in late 1983, when you had a seminary graduate assigned there to start a mission in that region. So didn't quite make it by 78, but that was a pretty aggressive goal at the time. When you figure in 1961, we're only in 16 states. We again had manpower issues in the early 60s, which slowed the start of things down. And then later we ended up having some financial challenges. One of the challenges was always, how can we build enough? Just the request to build chapels and parsonages, and the financial, again, infrastructure that goes into all that. And so there was always kind of a backlog of requests to get funding for the building of churches. And there were various synod fund drives that made efforts, that made some impact on those things. And but it is rather remarkable how, when you think of how much money the Wisconsin Synod spent on church work in those decades, it's kind of mind blowing in a way.
Yeah. And to tie into another episode that we've had, and you've brought it up more clearly in your thesis, is Mark Brown's work on Tale of the Two Synods. And one of the issues that you had brought up in your paper, at least, was the small synoditis which is a interesting term. But we had, like many other smaller church groups, it seemed as if the Wisconsin Synod had an inferiority complex, or even this fear that if we were on our own without another larger synod to lean on, we would just collapse. And I know that Mark Brown's paper kind of, I was in the conclusion or somewhere said, by the time we did every state by 78, it was almost like the opposite of, oh yeah, we really can do work, and we can be a national body, and not to the point of pride, hopefully, but just this idea that we can be faithful stewards, and God can bless this church body with great things. And I think that was kind of the takeaway I had from your paper. But anything else you want to say as far as the content? Maybe the final question is, in a sentence or two, what made the expansion of WELS missions in the 20th century seem so remarkable to you?
I think it's just that despite everything else that was going on and that the Synod was dealing with, from the debt initially to manpower challenges, to the doctrinal controversy with the Missouri Synod, and then to all the building projects that were going on throughout the Synod, from the synodical school level down to the local congregational level, that despite all of that, we go from, like I said, being in 12, 14 states and having no overseas mission work, to being in all 50 states and having work in 10 foreign countries. And that all happens within the span of just over 50 years. That just is what seems kind of remarkable to me. I was looking at some of the stats again. What's also interesting, especially in the decade after we broke with Missouri, the 2 decades after we broke with Missouri, the Wisconsin Synod grew at a higher percentage rate than the Missouri Synod did. I think we were like 36%, and they were about 20-some percent. And that also outpaced the growth of population in America. And it was at the same time when, you think of the 60s and 70s, there's this rebelliousness against authority. There's the liberalness that's occurring, the downward trend in a lot of the mainline, Methodist, Presbyterians, and so on are shrinking. And here the Wisconsin Synod, who made that stand in 1961 to be faithful to God's word. And it was a difficult decision to make, to break with the Missouri Synod. And we didn't, cocoon ourselves into our own, but we said we got to take this message out. And the Lord blessed the work that was able to be carried out. And I think in some ways we're sitting in a similar situation today in some ways.
Yeah, the numbers aren't necessarily trending upward in every way today, but there's definitely opportunities there. And it's not really my place to get on the stump for this, but our synod is doing the 100 missions in 10 years initiative. So it seems to me like that was at least inspired in part by, that Every State by 78 was a good program. We can't call it that again, but let's do something similar to that, kind of continuing that mission mindset that has been part of our heritage now for quite some time. All right. So that is the main bulk of our every podcast episode, is trying to get at least a feel for the content of your research. Now, there's no way we could cover everything. You have a lot of interesting details, a lot of statistics for those people who are interested in that. So I encourage everyone to get a hold on Professor Otto's paper, his thesis, which is available online. But now we're going to get into the historian side of this historical research. So Professor Otto, how did you get started on this topic?
Well, I had to have a topic for my master's thesis, so kind of starts out by necessity there. But I've always had an interest in this. Back in 1999, when I was pastor in Manitowoc, and we were at the 150th anniversary of the Wisconsin Synod, I wrote a paper on kind of how the break with Missouri moved us forward in Christ as a synod, and that sort of just that research I did for that project back when I was a much younger pastor, and wasn't able to do quite the extensive research that I knew I'd have available for this project, but it just got me thinking, and I just have always had an interest in the history of our Wisconsin Synod, and I thought this time frame is critical time, and I like mission history as well, and so that kind of got me started. Plus, when you go to school at another institution that is not familiar with your church body, it's sometimes fun to write something on your church body and give that institution and the people there, some flavor of what our church body is about. Plus, then my advisor really didn't know anything I was writing about, so there's that aspect too.
You weren't going to be challenged in every detail, is what you're saying, huh?
Yeah, I mean, not that I would make stuff up, but I love our church body's history, and so having the opportunity to dig into it more was something I really wanted to do.
Yeah, so it's kind of self-satisfying for you anyway, and it had another purpose as well. All right. So what was your research method like? You alluded to archives. I saw in one of the footnotes you interviewed one of the older professors who's no longer with us. But what did that look like?
I would say most of it was archival work, digging into meeting minutes, reports, mission reports, letters. I found the correspondence that went back and forth just fascinating. Give you a little kind of the personal side of things, and sometimes the disputes and disagreements maybe at times that are going on, but also the encouragement that's given. So a lot of it was a lot of trips down to the WELS archives, and digging around in there, looking at some local histories and some of the papers that were written by past seminary students for their church history paper. That used to be an assignment up until 2011 for every senior at the seminary. So that was pretty much. I think that was pretty much it. You meant, I mean, a couple of interviews, but not. I didn't do a lot of interviewing work. Most of it was archival work.
All right. So, what were some challenges you faced in conducting your research?
Having to make trips out to the WELS archives all the time, which is about a 45-minute drive from my house. Had I gotten on the project in a more timely way when the archives were still being stored at the seminary, that would have been a little bit easier. And it was just, it gets, I don't want to say tedious, but you've done some of that work before. You know how that is. You dig and finally find what you're looking for, or the thing that kind of hits you. But there's a lot of paging through one letter after another, one report after another, to try to find those gems of information that really help shed light on what was happening, and every so often you find that cool discovery that, oh, all right, there it is. So those were, I think, some of the challenges. Our archivist at the seminary, or at the Synod Archive, Susan Williams, is just super helpful. Was very helpful and things. One of the other things was paging through Old Northwestern Lutherans, the Synod's periodical. Just neat to see the reports that were given, the information that's given, the pictures that were in there, kind of shed some light on things as well.
Yeah, very neat. So you mentioned that this is the excitement of finding like a gem or something in your research, and I think anyone who does any primary source researching archival work, they kind of have both ends of that, where the tedium, maybe you're sneezing a lot from all the old dusty files that you're going through, the pages that haven't been opened for a quarter of a century or longer, but then you get that thing that gives you that aha moment and that excitement. So do you have an example or two of those gems that you found in your research that kind of just broke down some barriers for you?
I think a few things. A neat thing to find was in the Dakota, Montana district, there was this large map with push pins in it that indicated where there were Wisconsin Synod congregations, where there were Missouri Synod congregations. They were color coded by whether it was a self-supporting congregation or whether it was a mission congregation or just a preaching station. So that was kind of interesting. Gave you a little bit of a feel for where all the work was happening. Some of the exploratory reports, the report that was of the exploratory work going into Colorado, the exploratory trip down to Florida, and the maps that they produced, kind of showing where they were going and where congregations end up getting started. Some of the correspondence, I would say, was enlightening too. The letters going back and forth, and it just, especially going through like the presidential letters, it just floored me how much work and time was spent by some of these synod presidents answering letters. And sometimes as you're paging through them, they're coming from the same guy. The poor president his heart must have sunk every time he saw the return address of from certain people. But but they patiently answered questions and returned letters, and thankful for those for the fact that they were such good record keepers and had all that down. So I think those were probably some of the. Maybe one other one was finding a number of so Edgar Haneke, in his efforts to pay down, to encourage the synod to pay down the debt, was tasked by the synod to produce, I guess he called them bulletins. They were newsletter type of things that were sent out to all anybody who wanted them in the synod, giving information about the synod's work and kind of showing different graphs and pictures about how the synod's debt was being paid down and what could be done once we get it paid down, and finding a number of examples of those that it seemed like there weren't too many of them around before that. So being able to discover some of those was kind of fun. Still holding out hope. Haneke said in a letter that he wrote to somebody that I came across that he had all of them in his files. I could not find that file that had them all in there, so I don't know where that is, but love to find that one.
Yeah, but maybe that's in an attic somewhere that someone will.
Who knows?
Out,
yeah,
right? Yeah. All right. Well, that's part of the challenge too. You expect to find something and it's not there, but then you are pleasantly surprised when you find the things you didn't know existed. So final section is we just talk about Lutheran history in general, but maybe the last one on your paper, your thesis. In what ways do you believe your work has contributed to the broader WELS historiography or any other area?
I think you touched on it before, kind of taking a modern, a contemporary application. I just think, our synod at times, I think today is still in a place where there at least was that, what are we going to do? We've been experiencing decline in numbers. We've been experiencing sometimes some financial troubles. Right now we're dealing with manpower shortages. Oh, woe is us, we can't do anything. So telling this story, the history of what happened in these decades in the 20th century, maybe is contributing to some encouragement or inspiration for doing something today, that we could still do this. The Lord has given us this call. He will bless our efforts to get the gospel out there. I'm hoping that it contributed at least to kind of bringing together some of the mission stories that have been told in different disparate ways, trying to bring it together maybe in a more coherent or some kind of narrative that maybe is something that people will be able to read, and then see some ideas maybe for some future study.
All right. Do you have any leads for people if you think there is future study to do? What that might look like?
One of the things that it'd be interesting, and it would take somebody who has patience to sift through stat reports and mission reports. We started all these missions, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but not all of them, turned into still, functioning congregations that are still in existence today. I'd be interested to see what happened to some of those. Where did they end up? How long did they last? That kind of a study, I think, would have some interest, or be worthwhile, I should say. I think any kind of history on, personally, I think there are a lot of area Lutheran high schools that could use some historical treatment. It's a little bit different from maybe what I studied, but as far as I look at the general topic or general historiography of our church body, I think those are some areas that could use some study at, and just maybe in general, it's just kind of fun to a certain different congregation, like your congregation in Kenai, Alaska. I'm sure you've done some historical work on that. It's just kind of neat to see little short articles on some of those, on histories of local congregations like that. I think would be helpful to our synod. That's hopefully what we're going to be able to do, ideally with the new website for the WELS Historical Institute.
Yeah, I just checked out that website the other day, and it looks like it's had some overhaul already, and it looks very professional, very interesting. Looks like there's going to be a lot of material on that.
God willing, in the next years. And so, if you want to contribute anything, Pastor Phelps, please feel free.
Well, I've always got something cooking, but yeah, we'll see where it goes. But back to you then. Finally, do you have any upcoming projects in Lutheran history that you're working on at this time?
I just completed an article that'll be in the forthcoming Wisconsin Quarterly on Martin Chemnitz. So that was my most recent project. One of the projects I would like to write on is the history of the orphanage at East Fork, on the Apache reservation at East Fork. Again, because of some personal interest with my grandmother Otto, who went there and served there for a while. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a comprehensive history of that work. So that might be something I tackle next. I'm also going to be, I think in a couple of years, I'm tasked with giving a presentation on the history of Northwestern College in Watertown. I think that's for the 2025, so that's a little bit down the road. But so, like you said, there's always some irons in the fire, in different ways,
and all kind of different irons too. Not one of those are particularly related to one another, but all interesting though.
Yeah, I'm kind of the jack of all trades here at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. I teach, I think, this current calendar year, or this current school year, I'll end up teaching at least one section of all three major church history courses. So,
sounds like fun.
I'm the guy who's been here the longest now, so that's what happens, I guess.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, thank you, Professor Otto, for spending some time with us today and for sharing a bit of your research.
Happy to do so, Ben, and God's blessings to you on your historical research and your ministry to God's people in Kenai.
All right, thank you. Now, just a brief note to our audience who are listening today. I just want to let you know we've updated every episode description, so it has links for our website, Facebook page, email, and our YouTube channel. There are also links to support this show through Patreon and also the Lutheran History Shop, where you can get gifts for yourself while supporting the show. This episode, we get to give a shout out to our newest patron on Patreon, MJ Hinman. Thank you, MJ, for choosing to support Lutheran history. Tune in with us next month and you'll hear another episode.